We often talk about these huge technological projects, right? But we often forget the people involved. Like, take Pripyat, this like atomic city that just popped up in 1972. Can you imagine being one of those young specialists, all bright-eyed, arriving there, ready to build this nuclear future?
Yeah, it's really striking, isn't it? That pioneer spirit. They were okay with like basic living, no caved roads at first, no central heating, all to be part of this like cutting edge project.
Totally. It's like this
Yeah.
mix of ambition and uh, idealistic, I don't know, toughness.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's really where we're starting our deep dive today, right?
Yeah.
We're looking at the early days, the kind of how Chernobyl unfolded, especially at the very beginning.
Right.
And we've got some great material for this, Adam Higginbotham's Midnight in Chernobyl,
Hmm.
which has perspectives from like generals and doctors, but also what the plant workers went through, the whole political scene. So our goal is to really get into like the roots of it all and those first critical reactions.
Yeah. And, to understand all that, you got to factor in the Soviet system, right? The Communist Party wasn't just politics. It was like everywhere,
Yeah.
work, life, everything.
Right.
And even becoming a member, it wasn't simple. Applications, approvals. By 1970, only a small percentage of Soviet citizens were actually party members.
So being a party member, it was like a big deal, right?
Yeah.
Like you got better stuff, maybe info, even travel. But, and this is important for our story, it seems like if you wanted to get ahead in any important job, you kind of needed that party card.
Exactly.
So does that mean competence, like being good at your job, maybe took a backseat to, being loyal to the party? And could that have impacted safety at Chernobyl?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it shows how complicated the power structure was. Take Viktor Bukhanov, the plant director. He wasn't just answering to the Ministry of Energy in Moscow. He also had the regional party committee in Kiev breathing down his neck.
Two bosses.
Exactly. And that tension between Moscow and Kiev, it must have made decisions, especially under pressure, super complicated.
And Brukhanov, he seems like a really interesting guy, like a total workaholic, right? Always at the plant, day and night. When problems came up, and it seems they did a lot, he'd just like power through on coffee and cigarettes. Became this withdrawn, silent guy in meetings.
Yeah, and that's what's fascinating, this image of him getting more isolated, exhausted. And it wasn't just him. His original team, those enthusiastic young guys from the early days of Pripyat, they'd mostly moved on. He was left with a workforce described as, well, less disciplined. And he seemed to struggle to keep control. There's even this bit where the party construction chief, a powerful guy himself, calls Brukhanov a marshmallow.
A marshmallow.
Yeah, like not a strong leader, which in this super complex environment, that's a bit worrying, isn't it?
Totally. So we've got this huge nuclear project, this system with all its internal pressures, and a director who seems increasingly out of his depth. But the core of all this, the thing we got to understand first, is radiation itself. Without that, the whole disaster doesn't make sense.
Couldn't agree more. To put it simply, radiation is energy that gets released when unstable atoms break down. Now, atoms of different elements, they're defined by how many protons they have. Hydrogen has 1, oxygen has 8, and so on. That's their atomic number.
Right.
But the number of neutrons in an atom, that can vary. And that's how we get different isotopes, like deuterium. It's hydrogen, but with an extra neutron.
Right.
Or uranium-235, a particular uranium isotope with a few extra neutrons.
So these unstable isotopes, they're the radioactive ones, the ones that cause problems.
Exactly. And here's what's scary. Exposure to ionizing radiation, you often don't feel it. You could be getting a lethal dose and have no idea.
It's kind of creepy, right?
Yeah.
Makes me think of Harry K. Daghlian Jr. at Los Alamos. That young physicist working on the Manhattan Project. He had this accident in the lab with a plutonium core. He saw a flash, got hit with a huge dose of radiation, but at first he felt totally fine.
And that's what's crucial about that story. Even though he felt nothing, the damage was already being done internally. He managed to take the experiment apart really quickly and he got medical help, but it was too late. He died just 25 days later, the first recorded death from close contact with nuclear fission. And even the New York Times back then, they said it was burns from an industrial accident. Shows you how little people understood, or maybe how much they hid, about radiation's effects. So yeah, no immediate pain. That makes radiation really, really dangerous.
It's like a silent killer. Okay, so we have early Pripyat, the Soviet system, a seemingly overwhelmed director, and this invisible threat of radiation. What's next in the story? How did we get to Chernobyl?
To get the full picture, we got to rewind a bit more. Look at how the Soviet Union got into the nuclear game in the first place. The whole program, it really got going because of Igor Kurchatov. They call him the father of the Soviet atomic bomb. And get this, a key source of info for them was a U.S. government publication, Atomic Energy for Military Purposes. They quickly translated it into Russian.
Wow, that's ironic. This top-secret program, it started with public American info.
It did, but of course the Soviets weren't exactly open about their work. All the nuclear stuff was under the first main directorate, led by Lovrenesty Beria, Stalin's head of the secret police. Not a nice guy. From the get-go, the Soviet nuclear project was all about speed and secrecy. By 1950, they had hundreds of thousands of people working on it. And a lot of those were forced laborers, stuck in uranium mines, terrible conditions. Even after their sentences were done, many were basically kept in the system.
It's pretty dark. It wasn't just about science. It was built on forced labor and this huge culture of secrecy. And that secrecy, that's really important. It made things dangerous because mistakes weren't learned from, warning signs were ignored. It all played a part in what happened at Chernobyl. Now, when we talk about reactors themselves, the basic idea is to make enough heat from nuclear fission to turn water into steam, which spins turbines, makes electricity. But the real trick is to stop the fuel from getting too hot and melting down. That's where the control rods, the neutron moderator, and the coolant come in.
Exactly. Control rods, they go into the reactor core and they soak up neutrons, slowing down the chain reaction, even stopping it. Then there's the moderator. That surrounds the fuel rods, and its job is to keep that chain reaction going. Think of it as like the helper for fission. It slows down the neutrons so they hit more uranium atoms, keep the whole thing going. And the coolant, well, it does what it says. It flows through the core, taking away all that heat from fission.
So different countries, different times, they use different combos for these, right?
Totally. Early UK reactors, they used graphite as the moderator and air for cooling. Later in the US, they often used just boiling water for both. Each combination had its own risks and benefits. Water doesn't burn, but steam under pressure, that can explode. Graphite doesn't explode, but it can catch fire at high temperatures.
And this is where Chernobyl comes in, isn't it? The first Soviet reactors, including the RBMK design at Chernobyl, they used graphite for the moderator and water for the coolant.
And here's the thing, this combo, they copied it straight from those early Manhattan Project reactors. It was risky from the start. Something that burns right next to something that could explode.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what they thought was more important than that risk.
Okay, so we have this history of fast, secretive development, a reactor with built-in risks, and those systemic pressures we talked about. Now, let's go to the night of the disaster and meet some of the people involved. One of the key guys on the night shift at Unit 4 was Alexander Yevchenko, a senior mechanical engineer. He'd only been there 3 years. Interestingly, he used to be a competitive rower, a sport that requires crazy stamina, right? He was one of the best junior rowers in Moldova, even competed at the national level. You can almost see that discipline in his work.
I can see that. And like many who worked at the plant, he and his family moved to Pripyat.
How was that for them?
His wife, Natalia, wasn't so impressed with Pripyat when she first saw it. Kind of bland, especially in the winter. But then they got a 2-room apartment in a new part of town, top floor, and it felt like a palace to them. Great view of the river and the forest. They really started to build a life there, made their home nice and bright, like putting down roots, like young families do.
Sounds pretty idyllic. But, life's never perfect, is it?
No. In the days before April 25th, their little boy, Kirill, he had this bad cold that just wouldn't go away. They were juggling work and childcare. And on that afternoon, Natalia saw Alexander outside, giving Kirill a ride on his bike. Alexander had just finished a night shift, then spent all day looking after their son, no sleep at all, and he had another night shift in just a few hours. Natalia, she saw how tired he was, and she felt this, unease, even though it was a sunny day. Like a mother's intuition,
Right. It really hits home, doesn't it? You think about this huge disaster, and then there's this guy, exhausted, just trying to be a good dad.
Oh.
Now, another important person is Leonid Toptunov, the young reactor control engineer. He seemed to have a totally different outlook.
He did. Unlike Yevchenko, who was more grounded, Toptunov was drawn to what he called the cult of the atomshchiki, the disciples of the peaceful atom. He didn't want to stay in a small town and was really excited by this nuclear future, the prestige of it all.
His education really shows that, too. He studied at MEI in Obninsk, a top nuclear engineering school.
Absolutely. The work there was super tough, all the technical details of reactors. But it wasn't just science and tech. There was a lot of political stuff, too. Mandatory courses on, historical materialism and scientific communism. It was as much about Soviet ideology as about how reactors work.
So this mix of hardcore technical skills and Soviet worldview.
Right.
Okay, so as we get closer to the accident, what's happening at the plant in those last hours?
Just over 500 meters from control room number 4, you had the third watch of the paramilitary Fire Brigade number 2 outside their station. It was a quiet night. They were having a smoke, getting close to the end of their 24-hour shift. They weren't due to be relieved until morning. These were the guys who'd be first on the scene when things went wrong.
And Pripyat had its own fire brigade too, right?
Yeah, Brigade number 6. They had actually been called out earlier that evening. A small fire on the roof of the bus station. They put it out quickly. Seemed like a normal night for both brigades. The calm before the storm.
And inside the plant, I'm guessing the operators knew about some of the risks. Didn't they have, like, maximum design basis accidents they trained for?
Oh, yeah. One of the worst-case scenarios for the RB&K designers was a break in the pressure tubes. They called it the Maximalnaya Proknaya Avaria, which means basically maximum design basis accident. This also included things like earthquakes, a plane crashing into the plant, or a total break in the main water pipes, which could lead to a meltdown.
So they had backup systems for these situations.
They did. The designers came up with an emergency cooling system powered by nitrogen gas. And the operators, they drilled all the time on keeping water flowing to the reactor core, no matter what.
Sounds vital.
Mm.
But even with all this, there were accidents at other Soviet plants, accidents that were kept quiet, right?
It's true. There's a whole history of cover-ups. Like, in 1982, there was an explosion at the Metsamor plant in Armenia, big fire in the turbine hall. Then, a few years later, at the Balakovo plant in Russia, a relief valve blew during startup. Superheated steam killed 14 men. Both of these, they were hushed up. People at other plants, they only found out through rumors, little hints in the papers. Again, that secrecy, it meant they didn't learn from their mistakes, and it made Chernobyl more likely.
It's like they were setting themselves up for failure.
Okay.
Okay, let's zero in on Unit 4 right before the explosion. What were the operators doing in the control room?
From what we know, Anatoly Stolyarchuk was having trouble with the water levels in the steam separator drums. The pumps were going full blast, pushing tons of water into their reactor core every second. All this water was absorbing more and more neutrons, which, lowers the reactor's power.
Sense.
So the automatic system, it tried to fix this by pulling out more control rods.
Trying to keep things stable, but making things worse.
And then the water flow was so fast that it was almost boiling when it entered the core, even turning to steam in some spots. This made the reactor super sensitive to something called the positive void effect. It's a dangerous thing.
Right.
Basically, in this type of reactor, if you get steam bubbles, voids, in the water, instead of absorbing neutrons and slowing down the reaction, they actually speed it up.
Oh, so it's like a runaway train.
Exactly, a feedback loop. And this was built into the RBMK design, so sudden power surges, they were a real risk.
So basically a whole bunch of bad things were happening in the reactor core.
Right.
And I'm guessing outside the control room, people were starting to realize something was wrong.
Yeah. We know that Alexander Tunov, an engineer in the second administration building, was working late in his office on the 7th floor. From his window, he had a good view of the north side of the plant. Around 1:25 a.m., he heard this roar, and the whole building shook. Then, cracking sounds and 2 really heavy thumps.
Oh.
He looked out his window and saw all these sparks shooting out of the Unit 4 reactor building, molten metal or burning stuff falling everywhere. He even saw big chunks of debris landing on the roofs of Unit 3 and the auxiliary buildings, starting fires. His account was one of the first clear signs of just how bad this was.
And this is when the fire brigades got the call. What do they do?
Lieutenant Pravik, he didn't waste any time, gave the order to go. Those big red and white ZIL fire engines, they race out. Sergeant Alexander Petrovsky, one of the youngest firefighters, he didn't even have time to get his helmet, just grabbed Pravik's cap. It was 1:28 a.m. Anatoly Zakharov, the party secretary of the station, also a lifeguard in Pripyat, he was driving the lead truck straight towards the plant.
Brave guys.
Yeah, they had no idea what they were getting into.
Didn't Petrovsky actually have a connection to the plant?
He did. A few years back, as a teenager, he'd been part of the welding crew that built Units 3 and 4. He knew the whole place. He said back then there was always some background radiation, but nobody really worried about it. So as he drove towards that fire, he figured it was just a bit more radiation. It's really sad, because they had no clue how dangerous it actually was.
Right. So these local heroes are rushing in, and meanwhile, news is getting to higher-ups. 2 big names we need to know are Valery Legasov and Anatoly Alexandrov. Who were they?
Valery Legasov was a top scientist, really respected and well-connected in the party. He was known for being honest, and his career was going great. won lots of awards for his work in chemistry. People thought he was going to be the next head of the Kurchatov Institute, the leading Soviet nuclear research center after Alexandrov. He had a good life, influence, the perks of being a top scientist.
And Alexander, he was like the big boss of Soviet science.
Exactly. 83 years old at the time. Chairman of the Academy of Sciences, director of the Kurchatov Institute. He and Legasov were close, lived near each other, hung out sometimes. Alexandrov said Legasov was a sharp guy, thinking several moves ahead. So Legasov, who was only 49, he was the heir apparent. So while things were going crazy in Pripyat, the word was getting out, and these two guys, they were going to be right in the middle of it all.
As the scale of the accident became clearer, the official response, it seemed pretty confused, maybe even in denial. There were meetings happening in the Pripyat Communist Party headquarters.
Yeah, they took over the White House, as it was called. That was the local party HQ. Malamuz, the party boss from Kiev, he was there. General Ivanov, the civil defense chief who came from Moscow, he even suggested a radio broadcast to tell the people what was happening.
The radio broadcast.
Right, and his guys, they started checking radiation levels at the plant and in the city.
But a full evacuation, that wasn't even on the table, was it?
No. And the crazy thing is, the official rules for an evacuation were, well, by today's standards, they were really loose. The documents show that they'd only evacuate if people were predicted to get a lifetime radiation dose of 75 rem. That's 15 times the yearly limit for nuclear workers. Even the rules about telling the public about a radiation leak, they were all contradictory, and nobody knew for sure who could actually order an evacuation.
So it seems like they were more worried about panic and keeping secrets than they were about people's safety.
It definitely played a role. Sherbina, who would later head the government commission, he might have been truly worried about causing panic. But that Soviet thing, the need to control information, that was a big problem. By Saturday morning, the whole area was locked down by the militia, and the KGB cut off all the phone lines. But still, no public announcement in Pripyat, no warnings to stay inside. And even if they'd wanted to evacuate sooner, Sherbina knew they couldn't hide moving 50,000 people from Pripyat. It would be impossible to keep it secret.
So, as those crucial hours went by on Saturday, they were finally trying to figure out how bad the damage was, how high the radiation was. They even started an aerial survey.
Yeah, around 9 o'clock Saturday morning, a pilot, Volodin, he got orders to do a radiation survey of the whole area. He was supposed to pick up a civil defense officer with the equipment, but when he went to get dosimeters, those little radiation meters, the batteries were all corroded, dead.
Great.
The guy who could give him new batteries was busy with something else. So Volodin, he decided to just go without any personal radiation monitoring. And even though he had respirators and protective suits, it was a warm day, the cockpit was getting hot, so they just flew in their regular summer uniforms. Crazy, huh? He did pick up that civil defense guy who had military-grade equipment, and they headed toward Pripyat. The whole thing just shows you how chaotic it was, no proper procedures, people taking huge risks just to figure out what was happening.
Meanwhile, in Pripyat, rumors were spreading, and people were desperate for information. Alexander Korol, a friend of Leonid Toptunov, that young reactor control engineer, he was trying to find out what happened to his friend.
Yeah, Korol spent most of Saturday morning in Toptunov's apartment waiting. He'd heard rumors about a maximum design basis accident at Unit 4, but he couldn't believe anything that serious had happened. Eventually, Toptunov's girlfriend, who was a nurse, she came over and told Korol that the whole night shift was at hospital number 126 in Pripyat. And even worse, the most injured were being flown to a special clinic in Moscow that evening. So the truth was starting to come out, but it was all bits and pieces and really scary.
And Maria Pritsenko, the city architect, she kept working, totally unaware of the danger, even though things were clearly getting bad.
I know, right? While everything was falling apart at the plant, she went back to her office at the Ispolkom, the city hall, and kept drawing maps for the chemical troops who were now checking radiation levels all over the city. They told her that the hallways in the building itself were contaminated. And get this, because the janitors were gone, she even tried to mop the floors with a cloth and her bare hands, no gloves.
Oh my God.
It just shows you they had no clue what to do and how dedicated some people were to their jobs, even in the face of this invisible danger.
As Saturday went on, they finally decided to evacuate Pripyat, but it sounds like it was a total mess.
Yeah, the evacuation started in the early afternoon. Hundreds of buses taking people away. But most people had no idea where they were going, what had really happened. Nobody told them anything. And some of the buses, the ones they used first, they were so contaminated that they had to go back to be clean before they could pick up more people. People were trying to call family in Kiev, but they were being sent to random villages in the countryside. Brukhanov's wife, Valentina, she was seen crying as they drove her away. And on Natalia Yevchenko's bus, everyone was whispering, scared, not knowing where they'd end up.
So much chaos and fear. And some people had no idea any of this was happening.
Right. Protsenko said she saw a woman walking into Pripyat that evening with a suitcase, like everything was normal.
Whites.
The trains were still running on their regular schedule, and this woman was coming back from a trip, totally oblivious.
It's almost funny, in a dark way, but it also shows how badly they messed up the communication.
Completely.
News was starting to get out to the rest of the world, but the Soviets, they weren't saying much, were they?
No. There was a formal inquiry early on from someone called Ern, probably a Swedish official, because Sweden was picking up high radiation levels. But the Soviet response was basically, we'll get back to you. Nothing more.
Typical. And when they finally did say something publicly, they really downplayed the whole thing.
It wasn't until Monday evening, April 28th, 3 days after the explosions, that Radio Moscow finally made an announcement. It was a short statement from TASS, the official news agency. They said there'd been an accident, one reactor was damaged, and they were taking measures. Vague, typical Soviet way of dealing with bad news.
And of course, the Western media, they went crazy, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. Headlines like 2,000 die in Nuclear, stuff like that. The Soviets were trying to minimize things, and the West was going over the top. They were saying 2,000 people died immediately, but nobody knew that for sure.
So two completely different versions of the story. While this was going on, they started trying to put out the fire in the reactor, right? They even started this huge operation with helicopters.
Almost from the beginning, they were using the Pripyat Hotel as an air traffic control tower. General Antoshkin, he figured out this system for helicopters to drop tons of stuff into the reactor. Sand, boron, lead, dolomite. Pilots were flying right over the reactor, guided by people like Mimka, who were watching from rooftops and giving instructions by radio. It was super dangerous.
Incredibly brave pilots. And the people on the ground, the government commission, they were getting exposed to radiation too, right?
By this point, Shobina and his team, they were exhausted, and they'd gotten a big dose of radiation. They didn't get iodine tablets or dosimeters until way after the explosions, and even then, not everyone used them properly.
Not a good start.
No. And a lot of them started getting sick. Red eyes, sore throats, their voices changed, they felt nauseous, agitated. When they finally went back to Moscow on May 4th, they were all hospitalized. They took their clothes, watches, everything, and buried it as radioactive waste.
Wow. So while they were dealing with the immediate crisis back in Moscow, a group of scientists were trying to figure out the long-term risks.
Right. Evgeny Velikov, a big name in Soviet science, he put together a team, but it was mostly physicists, laser guys, plasma guys, not really nuclear experts. Their job was to learn about this RBMK-1000 reactor and see if it was going to melt down completely. They had to learn nuclear physics on the fly under huge pressure.
So the guys trying to prevent the worst-case scenario didn't even know how this specific reactor worked. That's crazy. And meanwhile, there were meetings going on in Moscow. And it sounds like the leaders didn't really grasp how bad things were.
Yeah, when Legasov and other scientists tried to explain things, the radiation, the burning graphite, the risk of a meltdown, some of the top party officials, they just didn't get it. Like Ligachev, Gorbachev's second in command, he told Shobina not to get carried away. And Sherbitsky, the Ukrainian party boss, he mixed up orangens and milliorongens. 1,000-fold difference.
They didn't understand basic radiation units.
It was a dangerous level of ignorance.
Then there's the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. They wanted to send a team to Chernobyl. That must have made the Soviets sweat.
It did. When Velikov heard that the IAEA team, including Hans Blix and Morris Rosen, was coming, he flipped out. He even told a deputy minister to tell Gorbachev, and I quote, "Our outhouse is overflowing and they'll have to climb a mountain of shit." Not very diplomatic, but he was making a point.
A very graphic point. What about that China syndrome thing? What was that, and what did they want to do about it?
The China syndrome, it was this nightmare scenario where the reactor core would melt through its container, through the concrete, all the way down to the groundwater, basically contaminating everything. To stop this, the scientists came up with a crazy plan: dig a huge chamber under the reactor and put in this gigantic water-cooled heat exchanger. It was like a giant ice pack for the Earth to stop the core from melting down further. To really drive the point home, one of the scientists even brought a chunk of melted concrete with uranium fuel in it to a meeting in Moscow.
Wow. So while they were planning all this, the human cost of the disaster was becoming clearer in the hospitals, especially for the people with the worst radiation poisoning. Leonid Toptunov, the reactor engineer, he was really suffering.
Yeah, Vera, his mother, she finally got to see him in the hospital. The doctors kept saying he was fine, but she saw that his skin, especially on his legs and feet, it was discolored, this awful bruised color. It was a clear sign of severe radiation damage.
Awful. They brought in a specialist from the U.S., right? Dr. Robert Gale, a bone marrow transplant expert.
Yeah, Dr. Gale was key. He heard about the accident at home in California and knew that bone marrow transplants could help. He flew to the Soviet Union to help treat the patients.
Finding donors must have been tough. I mean, the radiation was destroying their white blood cells.
It was. Their white blood cell counts were dropping so fast that they could barely do the test to find matches. And for the relatives who were matches, donating bone marrow was rough. Vera Toptunova, Leonid's mom, she went through it. Lots of needles in her hip bone to get the marrow. It was painful, and even then they didn't know if it would work.
Such a hard thing to go through. Sadly, some of the reactor operators, they didn't make it, including Toptunov.
It's true. Valery Perevychenko, he died the same day he got his transplant. Koptunov died a few days later. He had terrible burns and lung damage. His body just couldn't handle it. Viktor Preskuryakov, another young trainee, he also died from his burns. The radiation they got was just too much.
So sad. The Soviet military, they were brought in for the cleanup, weren't they? It was a massive effort.
Oh, yeah. Within days, Marshal Sergei Sokolov, the defense minister, he went to Chernobyl to run things. They were calling up young men from all over the place, telling them they were going to war. Their mission: liquidation of the consequences of the Chernobyl accident. They sent in hundreds of thousands of troops, radiation specialists, chemical warfare guys, civil defense.
One of the first jobs was dealing with all the radioactive debris around the reactor. They tried using robots, right?
Yeah, they sent in these huge remote-controlled bulldozers, one Soviet, one Finnish. They thought it would be safer, but the radiation was so strong, thousands of rounds per hour, the machine started breaking down. The Finnish one got stuck right away. The Soviet one lasted a bit longer, but it also died. By September, they'd abandoned these expensive machines near the reactor. It was just too much.
So back to basics. What did they do?
Well, for that huge pile of radioactive rubble on the north wall of the reactor building, they just covered it in concrete, tried to stop the dust from spreading. And for the contaminated soil around the plant, they used civil defense reservists, mostly older guys. They had basic respirators, regular uniforms, no real protection. They just dug up the soil with shovels. They could only work for a few minutes at a time, but it was hard and a lot of them got sick. Nosebleeds, dizziness, vomiting.
Terrible. There were even soldiers working inside the reactor building itself, doing incredibly dangerous jobs.
One really risky job was using a plasma torch to cut into the concrete wall between the reactor hall and the space below. They wanted to put in temperature and radiation sensors. One soldier, Pripyat, his dosimeter broke and he felt this stuff falling on him. He thought it was nuclear fuel, so he freaked out, ripped off his clothes, and ran. Turned out it was mostly sand and he was okay, but it shows you how scary it was in there.
They also dug a tunnel under the reactor, right?
Yeah, that was for the giant heat exchanger the scientists designed. The miners worked non-stop 3-hour shifts in this hot, cramped tunnel. The only thing protecting them from the radiation was the earth above. They used hand tools, pneumatic drills, all this noise, and they were told that if they messed up even a little bit, the whole reactor could collapse on them.
And all that work, all that risk, for a machine they never even used.
It's true. They never turned on that giant heat exchanger. The situation in the reactor changed too quickly.
Unbelievable. And as the cleanup went on, the military took over completely, right? General Voronnikov was put in charge.
By the end of May, Voronnikov, the guy who'd been in Afghanistan, he was in charge at Chernobyl. There were already tens of thousands of people working there, but he needed more. The Politburo was getting worried about the young soldiers, so they called up hundreds of thousands of reservists, guys up to 50 years old. Some of them thought they were going on exercises. Then they got to Chernobyl and found out the truth.
Beyond the cleanup at the plant, they also evacuated a huge area around Chernobyl, right?
Yeah, weeks after they evacuated Pripyat, they started moving people from the whole Kyiv region. 363,000 children, thousands of mothers. They used hundreds of trains, canceled people's vacations all over the country to house everyone. Kyiv was,